Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan.
Thus we have official announcements from the White House that Japanese airplanes have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and have now attacked Army and Navy bases in Manila, where hostilities now seem to be actually opening over the whole South Pacific.
Described destructive air raids on Malaya and a land attack on both Singapore and the British colony of Hong Kong. Japanese troops have crossed Thailand's border and have started to drive on the Burma Road.
There, north of Singapore, this vast Japanese expedition must be crushed and kept away from the attacks on the Netherlands, East Indies, and Australia.
February 1942. 2 months since fighting broke out in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and the Empire of Japan already controls one of the largest areas of land and sea in human history. British Malaya, British North Borneo and Ambon are lost. Guam and Hong Kong have been seized. The Philippines and Sumatra have been invaded, and then, on February 15, the unthinkable.
The civilized world reels beneath the news that Singapore, proud impregnable bastion, will fall.
Britain's impregnable fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, is lost. There seems no way of stopping Japan's relentless southern thrust, and the Japanese are eyeing their next target, Timor. On the morning of February 18, on a flattened coral aerodrome called Penfoe in Dutch Timor, Wing Commander Frank Headlam walks towards a mess hut filled with officers and airmen of No. 2 Squadron. 27-year-old Headlam is the commanding officer of 2 Squadron, a Royal Australian Air Force Hudson Squadron. The men waiting for him in the mess hut are mostly ground personnel, including mechanics, electricians, engine fitters and armourers. There are also officers and airmen skilled in cipher, signals, intelligence and meteorology. Headlam is about to deliver some bad news to his men.
Len reckons 10 transports, maybe more. They'll be day after tomorrow.
Hours earlier, reconnaissance reported a massive Japanese task force steaming from the north towards Timor across the Banda Sea. Invasion is inevitable. Shortly after reading the reconnaissance report, Headlam received a signal from his superiors at RAAF Station Darwin issuing a partial evacuation of the Penfoe aerodrome. Since the fall of Singapore, holding Java has become vital, and that means owning the skies above the island. But Java is dangerously short on fighters. There are 10 American P-40 Kitty Hawks languishing at RAAF Station Darwin. To get them to Java, men are needed at Penfoe to service and refuel them. To Headlam, it must be hard to believe that 10 lousy P-40s will make the slightest difference in the defence of Java. But while Headlam may have his orders, that doesn't mean he's going to blithely select a party from the 100-plus personnel stationed on Penfoe to remain behind. Not without asking them first.
Men, I've just received a signal ordering a general evacuation of this base. Only a skeleton crew is to remain behind to keep up essential services. I will need volunteers to staff the signals section to maintain radio communication with Darwin and ground crew to service our aircraft staging through. Now you can be sure that every effort will be made to pick up and fly back to Darwin the men who carry out these duties. So, who of you will remain behind?
Throughout the 2 months they've been operating out of Penfoe, Headlam's men have endured illness, endless work and numerous Japanese raids. Despite this, every man volunteers to stay. Headlam says he'll announce the makeup of the rear party within the hour. In the meantime, he is making available the remaining supply of beer to any off-duty personnel.
Except the grog. We drink the grog before we leave.
Nothing will be left to the enemy. Headlam turns his mind to selecting those who will stay behind and the man that will lead them. The group of airmen he selects will become designated the RAAF Rear Party on Timor. Over 6 episodes, I will tell you about those airmen, of how they came to be stranded on Timor, of the men who risked their lives to try and rescue them, and those sent to hunt them down. I found the story in official reports, journals, diaries, letters, memoirs, interrogations and court transcripts from war crimes tribunals held in the National Archives of Australia, the Australian War Memorial, the National Archives in Washington DC and personal collections. I also heard it from survivors. In retelling this story, I've kept to the facts. Where actors have been used to voice parts of real characters, they are speaking lines taken from primary source material. Dramatic sequences have been carefully recreated using multiple sources, which can be found in the show notes. And what follows is a story of survival, courage, leadership, mateship, and at certain points, cruelty and violence. But for me, this story is intensely personal. Because the officer Wing Commander Headlam would ultimately select to command the rear party was my grandfather.
Men and women of Australia.
Australians, you are the sons and daughters.
I'm Tom Trumbull, and this is Trapped.
Japanese naval and air forces launched an unprovoked attack.
The story of one of the greatest escapes of the Pacific War.
To work in the defence of Australia.
Chapter 1. Invasion.
All right. How many do we need to keep the drone running? And remember,
Headlam is discussing the makeup of the rear party with several officers. In the case of 5 of his men, Flying Officer Arthur Cole and 4 other airmen, they'll remain behind by default. Cole and his men are at present salvaging parts from 9 fighter aircraft that force landed far to the east, near the border of Portuguese Timor. They aren't expected to be back until the day of the expected invasion. Headlam decides that, including the salvage team, the rear party will comprise 23 ground personnel and wireless staff, and 6 officers.
the makeup of the party is as follows: Jim Sumner, Wally Grigg, Len Burke, Phil Keane, George Ettridge.
Headlam is back in the mess, reading out the names of the men who remain behind.
Cole Humphreys, Art Ackerman, Clyde.
The number of airmen chosen is the bare minimum to service the Kitty Hawks, maintain communications with Darwin, and make final preparations before evacuation.
The 6 officers of the party are Arthur Cole, Peter Thompson, Jock Birchall, Bill Arthur, and Ken Greaves. And the commanding officer is Bryan Rofe.
There is a ripple of surprise at Bryan's selection as commander. Bryan is a meteorological officer attached to the aerodrome rather than No. 2 Squadron. Most of the airmen barely know him. He nonetheless has command experience. He was the most senior officer in the 1st detachment sent to Timor 5 months earlier, responsible for a small group of personnel. He oversaw the building of a transmitting station, a signal station, an ops hut and barracks in 2 months, all while sending weather reports back to Darwin. To complete the task, Bryan was given a labour force of over 1,000 Timorese men. The job was finished on a tight schedule, and in the process, Bryan picked up a bit of Malay, the predominant language of Dutch Timor. He won high praise from the Timorese, who called him Tuan Besai, the big boss. But nobody thought higher of Bryan as an officer than Headlam himself.
Flight Lieutenant Bryan Rofe was outstanding in general duties. He worked untiringly in looking after the safety and welfare of both air and ground crews. In the last month, after the unit medical officer had been sent back to Darwin with malaria, Rofe did excellent work looking after the sick. He was at all times energetic and cheerful, and was an inspiration to other personnel. For these reasons, he was selected to lead the party.
Among the other 5 officers of the rear party, Headlam includes Pilot Officer Peter Thompson. 23-year-old Peter is the only trained pilot in the group, but a shortage of Hudson bombers has meant that for 4 weeks he's been stuck on Timor. Beyond the close friendship he had forged with Bryan, everyone admires and respects Peter. Headlam also knew that if things went bad, Bryan would need a close and trusted confidant. The rear party is comprised of men aged between 19 and 41. They come from all parts of Australia and have different musterings or jobs in the RAAF. But a 22-year-old engine fitter, leading aircraftman Bob Oliver, notices one thing they all have in common. They're all single. No wives, no dependents. There's a rumour that Bob and others had heard that when a group was selected for a dangerous mission, where the prospect of survival was far from assured, only single men were chosen. At 3:30 in the morning, the day before the expected arrival of the Japanese invasion fleet, Bryan Rofe escorts Headlam to one of the 5 Lockheed Hudsons that will take the commanding officer and his men back to Darwin. The plan is simple. The 10 Kitty Hawks will stage through around noon that day, Later that afternoon, Headlam will send back 2 Hudsons from Darwin to pick up the rear party 12 hours before the expected arrival of the invasion fleet.
Good luck, Rofe.
The 2 men shake hands and Headlam boards the plane. Bryan watches on as Headlam's plane clears the jungle at the end of the runway and disappears into the night sky. Here's what Bryan wrote at the beginning of his official report of what happened next.
I was left in charge of the RAAF party of 6 officers and 23 men after Wing Commander Headlam was ordered back to Darwin on the night of the 18th of February. It was arranged with him that Hudsons would return the following night to evacuate the remaining personnel. Unfortunately, this could not be done.
Daybreak, February 18, the day before Headlam departs Timor with the bulk of his men. Flying Officer Arthur Cole is eating breakfast with 4 Australian airmen in a hut in a Dutch Army outpost deep in the Timorese jungle. Their salvage mission is nearly complete. Soon they will head back to Penfoe. Cole is a ruggedly built 35-year-old equipment officer that Headlam turns to for every salvage operation. He's admired within 2 Squadron with an enthusiasm generally reserved for pilots. A Dutch soldier hands Cole a communique sent from Headlam, ordering Cole and his men back to the aerodrome before the scheduled evacuation of the rear party, which will happen in the evening of February 19. To make it in time, the sensible course of action would be to dump the salvage gear. Cole has other ideas.
Change of plan, fellas. Just got this message from Frank Headlam. We have to get back to the drome ASAP. I've spoken to these Dutch boys. They say there are canoes on the beach. We're going to take the gear to the beach, load it into the canoe.
They trek through the jungle with the salvage gear, which includes heavy machine guns and radio parts.
Pick it up, boys.
Eventually, they arrive at the coastal village where their transport awaits.
Just think, this time tomorrow we'll all be back in Darwin.
Timorese porters help carry their load to the beach before they all pile the gear into 2 large outrigger canoes. They paddle 5 kilometres to their awaiting transport, and when they get there, the transport has vanished, commandeered by a Dutch unit. Time is running short. Cole and his salvage party appear to be stranded. It's 1 in the morning on February 20, back at the Penfoe aerodrome. Bryan is briefing his men in the mess. The 10 P-40s never showed up, and neither did the 2 Hudsons. Repeated attempts to hail Darwin all through the previous day have failed. There's only one explanation. Darwin has been hit, and hit hard. The evacuation is off, at least for now. They're going to have to quit the aerodrome and make for the jungle. The airmen are seated on wooden benches. None of those men have slept in 2 days. They've already been told to pack haversacks that they dub piss-off kits, holding their essential items. Bryan orders Flying Officer Jock Birchall to take half the men in one of the 2 GMC trucks they have at their disposal and head south for Paha River.
Yes, fine.
At 41 years of age, Birchall is the old man of the group. He's an intelligence officer born in Manchester who served in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers during the British occupation of Germany after the First World War. Bryan will stick around with Peter and the wireless team in the hope of hailing Darwin and requesting a flying boat rescue at the mouth of the Paha. The wireless team had organised a portable transceiver, but it's untested. Bryan figures his best chance of getting a signal to Darwin is with Penfoe's powerful transmitter. They would then rendezvous with Birchall's group for a shoreline evacuation. That's when they hear it, an approaching engine. The airmen step outside. Eventually, a truck's dimmed-out headlights is seen careening up the road towards the mess. When it stops, all the dust and debris that had been trailing in its wake rushes past the bonnet and into the eyes of the stunned onlookers. The car's occupants are jammed in alongside 8 Kitty Hawk machine guns, radio sets and other spare parts.
Where are those Hudsons that were supposed to take us out of this hole?
There won't be any Hudsons, Arthur.
The mountain road between the Dutch Army jungle outpost and the aerodrome generally took more than 10 hours. Cole had done it in 7 and mostly in the dark. Bryan surely smiled. His strongest man had returned. They'd need Cole's stamina and fortitude for what awaited them in the jungle. As the first rays of sunshine break over Timor, Bryan receives a message in the SIG station from an AIF soldier. Enemy troops are landing in force on the southern coast. There's no exact fix on the number of Japanese, but there are thousands of them. And they're landing near the mouth of the Paha River. Burchell will be walking into a slaughter. Bryan and Peter run out of the SIG station and look up. High above, they see the oversized floats of a small Japanese seaplane. Incendiaries rain down on their position. Japanese ships are shelling the drone. Sitting out to sea, from a point beyond the view of the airmen, the light cruiser Jinsu is leading 2 destroyers in the naval bombardment of Timor. The seaplane is coordinating the naval gunfire. The shelling steps up in ferocity, the assault reducing the wooden barracks to rubble and caving in the wall of the aircraft hangar. The naval barrage stays clear of the coral strips. It seems the Japanese intend to keep the strips intact for their own use. Australian soldiers have other ideas. Coral explodes in fountain-like bursts along the entire length of the runway. Australian soldiers start setting off mines laid in the strips weeks earlier. They're under orders to destroy the runways the very moment the Japanese attack. The strips are reduced to craters and rubble in minutes. If the Hudson suddenly turned up, they'd have nowhere to land.
Run! Signal Darwin!
Bryan runs back inside the SIG station and orders a signalman to advise Darwin that the runways are destroyed and to suggest alternative rescue points. The invasion force is still a day's march away. Bryan is going to wait out the storm, giving Darwin every chance to signal them. He changes his mind almost instantly. The ground shakes, knocking Bryan over. Bright orange pillars of flame propel hundreds of feet in the air, not far from the transmitter. No sooner has the explosion billowed into clouds of black smoke than a fresh set of fiery columns shoot skywards. The soldiers are sending up the bomb dumps near the transmitting station half a kilometre away. Bryan decides it's time to leave.
Finding that we could not get anything out of Darwin, and shells were coming uncomfortably close, bomb dumps with 750-pound bombs going up in batches of 30, and the blowing of the drone continuing, I decided to hit the trail as we were merely sitting on our tails, just waiting.
Bryan and the remaining 13 men cram into the back of the truck. Bryan looks up. The float plane has gone. Something new is happening. Bryan shouts at his men in the back of the truck to hold on.
Tight, boys.
Bryan and Peter jump into the front
Floor
cab,
it, Jim.
and the driver floors it. They head out of Penfoe along the Dili Road, the single track that connects Timor's 2 major towns, Kopang in the west and Dili in Portuguese Timor in the east. The Army's fixed defences and coastal batteries are arranged in close proximity to the road. This stretch of road is soon to become the most dangerous place in Timor. As they drive, Bryan and Peter lean forward, scanning the skies through the windows.
They're coming! Keep your bloody heads down!
The sound of anti-aircraft batteries tell the men in the truck that they're coming. The scream of diving Zeros and machine gun bursts ring loudly over the sound of the truck's engine. Then the Zeros clear off, and Bryan sees them. A large formation of Betty bombers are coming in fast from the north. The ground quakes as the fixed defences are carpet bombed. Bryan registers one thought as all hell breaks loose. Timor is lost. The truck makes it through the bombing raid. In the front of the cab, and with the threat momentarily past, Peter Thompson's mind wanders to the pain in his leg. Never the type to complain or voice his own ills, he's told no one about the small wound he received days earlier on the back of his leg that has now begun to fester. Beside him, Bryan's mind turns to Jock Burchell. They must try to catch up with him and the other men before the Japanese invasion force lands, and Bryan knows the only way to get to the southern coast is along a track that intersects with the Dili Road at a village called Babao. And that's where they're headed. The driver has the accelerator down the whole way. Babao is little more than a few Timorese huts. Bryan finds the village practically deserted. No sign of Burchell and the others. The driver stops the truck near a command post where a small detachment of soldiers and medical non-combatants wander around looking lost and terrified. Bryan leaps out of the truck and starts asking questions.
Hey, you there? Wait, I'm looking for a group
They tell him Birchall and the airmen were in Babao when the southern invasion was reported. And the airmen decided to head farther east to the Sparrow Force headquarters in the village of Champlong. Bryan breathes a sigh of relief. He thanks those men and wishes them good luck. He'd be the last Allied serviceman to see the detachment of men alive. Bryan races back to the truck and takes stock of his men. Corporal Roy Andrews is smoking a cigarette and cracking jokes, as relaxed as if he were enjoying a Sunday drive through the country. He's known to have a good sense of humour and for making light of seriously dangerous situations. His efforts to do so are always welcomed.
Told you I was turning this place into an inferno and I can't get a flame to light me last smoke.
He's talking with leading aircraftman Clyde Pappen, leading aircraftman Len Burke and Private Clem Clements. Army signalman Clements had been on loan to 2 Squadron to ease the burden on the aerodrome's personnel shortage for the last few weeks, and Bryan had completely forgot about him. Clem should be with the 2nd 40th Battalion, preparing to fight with his unit, but there's no way of knowing where they are. Looking back from where they came, Bryan can hear the sound of explosions and the whine of enemy fighters and machine gun bursts. But the guns from the sea are silent. Bryan knows this means another bombing raid is coming.
Listen up.
Before he jumps into the cab, he tells his men that they will stop for fighters, but they won't stop for bombers.
If anyone spots a Zero...
A service truck has no hope of outrunning a Zero fighter aircraft, but a bomber pilot wouldn't waste his payload on a moving target. If they get caught under a bombing run, that's just bad luck. Bryan climbs into the cab and the truck roars off. As the adrenaline slowly seeps out of his body, he feels a wave of exhaustion. He calculates that he hasn't slept in 51 hours. He turns to his friend, Peter, who's been up with him for that whole time. Peter looks terrible, worse than he should, notwithstanding the stress, fear and sleeplessness. Before Bryan can ask after him, a curtain of black smoke and flame envelops the world not far behind them. Bryan looks up and sees another flight of Betty bombers heading off. Then someone starts banging on the roof of the cab.
Look! Zeros! Stop the truck! Fighters! Fighters!
The driver slams on the brakes and everyone hops out of the truck.
Take cover!
Machine gun fire rips up the ground around them. They've stopped in the middle of a field. There's basically nowhere to hide. They dive into ditches either side of the road as a second Zero strafes the truck. That's when Bryan hears it. A low, indistinct drone, getting louder. Bryan looks back behind him. A formation of 27 Japanese aircraft approaches. They look like bombers, but they're coming in far too low. Bryan and his men are routed to the spot. The aircraft are directly overhead. The men on the ground steel themselves. This is it. But instead of bombs falling out of the planes, the sky fills with parachute canopies.
We were about 7 minutes out of Babao when I stopped the truck and allowed the mob to scatter. Wave after wave of bombers flew over and dropped paratroopers.
It looks like there are hundreds of them, and they're about 30 seconds from landing.
Everyone back in the truck! Get up! Move!
The driver is back in the truck in a blink. He turns the key in the ignition.
Get us out of here! Come on!
The engine doesn't start. Next time on Trapped.
With a native population of 700,000, ruled prior to February 1942 by Dutch and Portuguese, Timor is today ostensibly Japanese.
I shall represent the Eastern people to make all of our anger blown up in the faces of the Anglo-Saxons.
You and your men are to hold the Dili Road.
Dili Road? Army of Japanese, 30 men have never been trained. Well, what bit hold the Dili Road? We would never held the Dili Road against 500 paratroopers just landed.
Brigadier Veal, with respect, sir, we are 29 men with barely any small arms training.
You have your orders. Now go out there and hold that bloody road!
Trapped was written and produced by Tom Trumbull with Sam Lloyd, James Milsom and Ryan Pemberton for the Australian War Memorial.